So I made a video yesterday regarding about when somebody who doesn't have a lawful entry or an entry with inspection can still adjust status in the US. And I got a couple comments regarding Quilantan entries. This is one of them. Can you talk more about how matter of Quilantan works? If someone entered through the border with no documents, but was not questioned let through, how does that work? So first, and I had to correct some of you, a Quilantan entry is technically with inspection. That's why I didn't include it on the list. In other words, when you try to adjust status and you argue a Quilantan entry, you are arguing that you entered with inspection, even though you might not have the proof. And so a Quilantan entry is when someone essentially comes to the United States through usually a port of entry, and they might not have a valid visa or a green card, but many times, for example, they were waived through. So this is very true for people who might have entered in the 80s and 90s and sometimes even early 2000s, where they were passengers in a vehicle, right? And they entered through a United States port of entry, and the officer might have waved the car through like this, or might have only inspected the documentation of the driver, or asked who was in the car, or even sometimes, documents were provided, they just weren't yours. And in that case, it's with an inspection. You just might need a fraud waiver in that situation. So there are various types of Quilantan entries. Some are with other documents, some are not presenting any documents at all. You're just waived through. If you did use somebody else's documents, then you need to prove that that you did use those documents. If you don't have them, you need to try and get them, or at least provide affidavits, substantiating it from friends, family, yourself, and also a fraud waiver, because essentially that's fraud. You can never waive, though, holding yourself out to be a U.S. citizen. So if you use somebody's U.S. passport or, for example, birth certificate, that is not going to be forgiven. Now, if you do the Quilantan, if you had a Quilantan entry but you didn't present documents, you won't need the fraud waiver. Again, the biggest issue with the Quilantan cases is convincing them, USCIS, that in fact this is how you entered and you didn't just enter without inspection, that you were inspected. And inspected doesn't mean a stamp, right? It just means they could have asked you questions but they didn't, right? And they waved you on through. So that can be done, substantiated in a lot of ways. Another question I got was about a 601A waiver. Can you do an adjustment arguing Quilantan, but also at the same time do a waiver? And you cannot, because a waiver essentially is saying you entered without inspection. So if you entered with inspection, you have to state that you entered with inspection. Whether they believe you is kind of on them. And then if they deny you based on the fact that they do not have proof that you entered with inspection, then you can use that to then do the waiver and then do your consular interview. And at the interview, if they ask how you entered, you're not contradicting yourself and saying, well, I entered with inspection. And they say, well, here it says you didn't enter with inspection. You say, well, that's because USCIS found that I hadn't substantiated it, but I did come through this port of entry. So that's why you can't kind of do both at the same time. You do one first, and then if that gets denied or USCIS doesn't have enough evidence to kind of substantiate that lawful entry, then sure, you could move forward with the I-601A waiver if that applies in your case. But we have to be honest and we have to tell the truth. And if you entered through a port of entry, then you entered through a port of entry and you have to state that.